Northeast of Venezuela, a small island named Tobago is home to beautiful beaches and tropical trees. It was also used for the shipping trade locations during the colonial period. The size of Tobago is tiny compared to other islands, only at 120 square miles, but this did not prevent large nations from visiting the land. In 1773, a British sailor risked his ship, his crew's lives, and his own to reach the sandy shores. Once he arrived, his crew tried to mutiny. The British captain drew his sword in self-defense, and it led to the death of a mutineer. The captain fled Tobago and found refuge in the American colonies. A few years later, he would become the leading naval commander for the United States Continental Navy, and his name was John Paul Jones. On the 6th of July, 1774, John Paul Jones was born as John Paul in Kirkcudbright, Scotland. His parents were John Paul Sr. and Jean Duff. Senior John Paul worked as a lead gardener for William Craik's estate. John Paul saw that his father was a hard worker and he wanted to rival his work ethic. At the age of 12, he entered the British Merchant Marine and went to the sea for the first time as a cabin boy. While at sea, he learned that men could work their way up the ranks. His ambitions would be quenched much earlier than he believed. John Paul sailed many voyages, traveling all over the world. He even visited his older brother in Fredericksburg, Virginia, while in training. These experiences shaped his insight on how good the shipping trade can be, while also showing how horrific it was. While as a crew hand, John Paul wanted to see the beautiful continent of Africa, and he was quick to take the only job that went south, which were slaving ships. These brutal trips killed thousands of African slaves and sailors while en route. This was often due to the lack of fresh food, water, and hygiene. These memories would haunt him for the rest of his life. Years later, after leaving the slave trade, John Paul took a job on the ship named John and was making his way to Scotland after leaving Jamaica. This trip would seem to be routine, but something strange happened. Some of the crew became sick with yellow fever. Yellow fever is a tropical disease that attacks the kidneys and the liver, turning the skin yellow. Unfortunately, the captain and first mate died from the fever. This left the crew in disarray. John Paul calmed the crew down and took control of the ship. For the remainder of the voyage, he worked tooth and nail to sail the men back home. When they made it to Scotland, the crew became ecstatic. As a reward, the grateful Scottish owners made him captain of the ship and its crew and gave him 10% of the cargo. This fame and wealth would only last short term. A few voyages later, John Paul's crew would become mad at him for working the sailors too hard. To counter this, John Paul would start enforcing the British Admiralty's codes. If the sailors did not comply, he would order them to be flogged. The ship's carpenter, Mungo Maxwell, was flogged by John Paul in 1770. When their ship reached the port in Tobago, Maxwell went straight to the island's authority. Maxwell filed charges of assault and unjust abuse in the Admiralty court. The court found Paul not guilty. With his name clear, John Paul went back home to Scotland to find a new route. As soon as he landed, John Paul was arrested again, but this time for an unjust death. He was unsure why, because he never killed anyone. While in jail, news came to him about Maxwell dying on his voyage to Kirkcudbright. Stunned by this news, John Paul knew that he was a free man and posted bail and headed back to Tobago. This trip took several months to get a court record from the Tobago courts about Paul's flogging incident. This audit proved to be worth it. Next, Paul sailed back home to the Scottish courts. The judge read the letter and determined that Maxwell's life was not in danger from the flogging he received from Paul. Maxwell's death was from a fever. John Paul was found not guilty again. With another weight off his shoulders, John Paul looked for more work. The Betsy was his new ship, It was hauling wine and butter to the West Indies. Bad luck hit Paul again, and the ship was in disarray and needed repairs to be conducted immediately. This put the Betsy behind schedule. The butter spoiled and the ship's funds started to dry up. Paul pushed his luck only with half of his cargo and sailed to Tobago. In 1773, Paul reached the island and his crew was livid. The crew of the Betsy had been talking about a mutiny if they were not paid. Upon arrival, the lead mutineer made a ruckus and confronted Paul, demanding payment. John Paul told the sailor that the contract was for a round trip and the payment would be received once they returned home. Paul tried to calm him down by giving him a fine set of clothing, but this did not stop the mutineer's rage. He followed Paul into the captain's quarters where he attacked him. The ringleader, having thrice my strength, grabbed a cudgel. I was thunderstruck with surprise. The assailant raised his arm high and threw his body forward to reach the master's head with the descending blow, the fatal and unavoidable consequence of which was his rushing upon the sword. With the lead mutineer dead inside Paul's own quarters, he needed to do something fast. Unlike the last few run-ins with the law, Paul decided to turn himself in right away so that no more charges could be added, even though the death was caused by self-defense. Unfortunately, the Tobago judge was not on the island at the time, and Paul had 0 charges, so he took this as fate and left the island. While sailing to his new home, he would change his name so that nobody could find him. For most of this story, we heard him as John Paul, but once Paul made it to his new home in the American colonies in 1775, he changed his name to John Paul Jones to elude the British Admiralty. From here, we will refer to him as Jones. Jones's goal was to live a low life with his brother in Virginia, but he died a few years before. Now a lost soul in the New World, Jones had to make a new plan. He ran into 2 men, one being Patrick Henry, and the other being Thomas Jefferson. After being acquainted with these 2 gentlemen, the American Revolution broke out on April 19, 1775. In December of that year, Jones was recruited to the Continental Navy's flagship, Alfred, and served as first lieutenant. This was a step up and down for Jones. He was no longer a captain, but he led the crew to many successes. During her service in the Continental Navy, Alfred captured 12 British Royal Navy and merchant ships. Later in the war, Jones got his wish, and in November 1777, he was given the ship Ranger, but this was no battleship. Very disappointed, he took actions into his own hands. Jones departed overseas to find and build his own fleet for the Continental Navy. He landed in France, and a few ships were available for sale. The notable one was the Bon Richard. In addition, 2 French privateer ships joined the fleet, bringing the new total to 6. Instead of going back to America to play defense, Jones decided to go on the offensive. He sailed to the English coast and ran into the HMS Cyprus on September 23, 1779. The British sailors thought this was going to be a short skirmish, but they were wrong. A battle soon followed and took place on the North Sea. The HMS Cyprus fought hard and did not give way to Jones's onslaught, even though they were outnumbered. Jones was losing the engagement, but did not give up. He rallied his crew together, making a final push on the HMS Cyprus, saying, "I have not yet begun to fight." Soon after, the captain of the Cyprus surrendered to Jones, and it was commandeered. Jones's attacking ship would sink a few hours later. Cheers amongst the crew roared throughout the night. England was hit at home for the first time. No country thought a small band of rebels from a distant colony could beat the best navy in the world in their own waters. He even raided a few British towns, like Whitehaven Harbor in 1778. Once again, bad luck struck. After the American Revolution, Jones's ships returned to port and needed long-term repairs. John Paul Jones was no doubt a competent leader in the Continental Navy, but some politicians back in the United States thought there was no need for a fleet anymore. Now out of a job, Jones needed to find work and headed back to Europe. Russia gave him a short-term position where John Paul Jones took on the Turks. After a short stint, he headed to Paris. Suddenly, Jones became ill. A kidney ailment, nephritis, mixed with pneumonia, caused John Paul Jones's death at the age of 45 on July 18, 1792. He was laid to rest in Paris's St. Louis Cemetery. Unfortunately, after Jones's death, he would still have bad luck. The French Revolution broke out, and the cemetery was sold to the new government and was forgotten about. Years of decay and neglect made the cemetery unrecognizable to outsiders. Dust to dust it seemed to be. Over 100 years later, many people forgot about John Paul Jones, except for a few important ones. One of them being President Theodore Roosevelt. In 1905, the U.S. ambassador to France, Horace Porter, discovered John Paul Jones's grave after a 6-year search. His casket was open and John Paul Jones's face was still recognizable. This was due to the embalming process used on his body, which was a mix of cloth wrapping and alcohol, something like the Egyptian pharaohs. His body was also placed in a lead coffin which did not decay. Jones was given a similar coffin to Napoleon's and a huge parade through the streets of Paris. 4 cruisers brought Jones's body back to the U.S. and 7 battleships escorted him up the Chesapeake Bay. On January 26, 1913, John Paul Jones was laid to rest in the crypt of the U.S. Naval Chapel in Annapolis, Maryland. John Paul Jones was finally home. His life would never be forgotten again, and the United States of America would honor him in many ways. First, the United States Navy named 2 ships after him, the USS John Paul Jones DD-932 and the USS John Paul Jones DDG-53. In the film Destroyer, a ship was named the USS John Paul Jones II. Lastly, Jimmy Driftwood wrote a song called John Paul Jones in 1959 on the RCA label, which was later covered by the famous Johnny Horton. John Paul Jones sailed all over the world and betted his life on an idea that all men and women should be free. Immortality is only achieved by the ones who never met you, but know you. It seems to be a law of nature, inflexible, inexorable, that those who will not risk cannot win. Thank you for reaching the end of this lesson. Claude's history course covers famous people and events throughout world history. To stay up to date for free future uploads, subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Comment down below which person or event you want to see covered next, and we will see you next time on Claude's history course.